Again in studio. This time about different forms of health, but from science point. To understand science and medicine, of course, it's not easy. Like it's not simple to understand any forms of healthy partners you might have. If you are leading a company, it becomes extremely difficult what type of health you should put the company on. And of course, other people might also look to improve themselves every day. To understand the frequency that actually come with sound, it actually come with different forms of the medicine together with the healing. And it's not easy to understand. Imagine the body like this. The body is actually very, very difficult. And if you put it under abstraction, then you just have like 20 fingers or 50 fingers or 100 fingers. And you have like 1,000 heads. And you have like 1,000,000 legs. So if you put everything under abstraction, it actually becomes very, very difficult, especially for standard medicine to understand. So imagine that adults might be a little bit strange, are really, really strange when you come to medicine because they will want that everything become very, very structured. But what if humans are just not structured? What if humans are more souls or something? What if humans are more made on a sound? And humans are maybe more strange than you think. The ultrasound image of a fetus in a womb viewed at 20, actually 12 weeks of pregnancy of woman, that's also ultrasound. But it also provide an image. Of course, doctors could do that. But what if you could do that with your computer and just put the sensor on a computer and do the ultrasound with image by yourself? Of course, it's not easy to imagine that, but also it's not easy to understand human medicine. To understand different forms of radiologist is very difficult, especially if you put that together with the imaging. Also, it's very difficult if you imagine that all women in the world are animals and all men in the world are animals. Of course, then doctors would have no meanings. It is necessary as a science to see humans as a humans. But of course, some things of humans are actually related to animals. So it's very difficult to understand any form of evolution when it comes to humans. Also, those films means making are not perfect. But whatever humans you are going to find on this planet, you are not going to find anything perfect about it. Also, talking about technology is 100% prohibited in my company and in my brand. It's 100% that it's also prohibited to talk about the name of company or brand of company or even the characteristics of the company or the health of company. Not everything is prohibited, but a lot of things are prohibited because that's simple form of the correct frequency. You must be simple about it, especially with all the beings that are in company, because the company must also heal others, and there are different forms of the therapies that come along with the brand. It's very difficult to understand all the strains in a company, but also different forms of syndrome that occur during work. To understand different forms of therapeutic applications, it's not simple. To understand simple forms of medicine, it's also not simple. And also, it's not simple to understand any form of the woman. Also, the animals can have pregnancy, but it's also very important to understand different forms of the skilled doctors that actually make a better forum together with the life. To understand professionals, especially in Taoism, it is not easy because they actually have a thousands of different methods that usual doctors. But the usual doctors sometimes also hurt the body, so that might be the main but not small problem of the usual doctors. The specific forms of molecules that come to you during the sound, of course, are not simple. To understand gaining more control about the company, it's again not simple. Most of people want to work more for more money, but they don't want more responsibility or more money owning anything. People just want quick results. To understand simple forms of the emergency together with the better forms of the caring for your zone, actually, it's very important to understand simple forms of the focus on different forms of application if you are building together with applications. Understand different procedure that could occur different forms of radiation is also not simple, and different apartments should be involved in that. To think about evolution when it comes to women, probably you must be mad if you are thinking about any form of evolution on that area, because humans usually become pregnant from the age 15 to the age 25, but some also later. Of course, pregnancy before 15 is extremely unhealthy, but sometimes also occur in less evolved areas like Africa. To understand different forms of the nerves is also very important. And of course, if you think about different animals in this world, they also bring many diseases. To understand different forms of the crystals, it's also important together with our settings and to build the proper setting in the United States, especially the different forms of emergency, to understand better form of medicine, but also to understand the better forms of the software if you want to understand software better. Together with the software, there are a lot of clinic forums, but me is referring also on Taoism, because then applications become difficult, but also to some part actually more made for humans. Very, very hard to explain that. Also, to talking about Taoism might be prohibited. It is not a simple theme, and there are millions of specialists on that area. Also, to understand different forms of the sound, actually, it's not simple if we think from the point you was born in United States. To understand the whole structure of the different forms of psychicans is not easy. But of course, every human also have some weaknesses in life. A lot of people think that in life you should not use any form of ultrasound, but in fact you should actually use it by yourself. That's actually very important. Do not follow any forms of quick exams if you are going to look for superior conditions, because those might be in simple forms of Taoism and not in criteria of extreme doctors. To understand patients in clinics also is not simple because they all want different forms of the vitamins. Of course, people might have different forms of traumas, but they might have also different forms of traumas about their boyfriends, especially pretty girls. To understand those forms is very important. But it's also important to understand specific modeling if you are in modeling sector. To understand different CT scans is also important if you are looking for the simple forms of diagnostics. But if you look from the other forums, there are also simple forums that you can make at home with your own computer, very city forums. You don't need any forms of laboratory or any forms of tomography. To understand different forms of the history is also important if you are going to raise money. Depends what other people did spend on you. Also, to understand different forms of the components that come along with politics and how to limit politics is the most important if you want to prevent the injury. To understand different nerves that are in a political systems is very important, but also defensive graphics if you are coding. To understand different forms of the index, of course, might be also very important, and also building the syndromes, especially if you have any forum of the company. To understand different forms of the bone is also very important, but also to understand different forms of diagnosis. Of course, different forms of the settings might occur during the Taoism, but you must build a better sort of yourself with image if you are modeling also. The way there are emergency in medicine sector, probably they are all wrong. Not all doctors will think about that in that way, but of course there are thousands of ways you can think about that anyway. It is very difficult to understand different forms of the medicine, but also different forms of relations human might have with each other. Especially development of models might be extremely difficult, and there are different forms of the age that come along with that. Ethics are most important, so you do not end in jail like some leaders might, but you actually understand medicine much better. To understand different forms of elastics in modeling is also important, but probably that come together with some sort of gymnastics. To understand artery is also important, but also different forms of the way to build better models. Of course, the lungs are also important, but if you are drinking millions of teas, you can actually build better lungs. To understand different forms of the simple forms, but also the pressure that come with software industry, then you might also understand how frustrated some models could be, or they might even wish death to others. To understand different forms of the difference between one model and other is very important. So you are going to prevent any type of force or any type of chaos during the development. The blood pressure is very difficult, and if you are thinking about the blood pressure also referring to my novel G and Tommy, actually simple book about the medicine, but also the fiction. If you think that medicine is not a fiction, also think about your mental health. Also, not all doctors have good mental health. Some are also confused when it comes to Taoism. For example, let's think about doctor that's going to think about stop smoking. The smoking is for some people like cocaine and extreme difficult. For some people it might be hard like a pregnancy or some sort of extreme disorder which might even lead to injury, and how much pressure is in that. So the history is extremely difficult. And of course, some politics might not want to pay for it. They might not want to pay for the medicine or the better life of people. To understand traumas you can have with politics or with smoking, of course, is extremely difficult. To understand a better image, it's not easy, especially not in medicine, because it come along with different forms of simple resonance. And they also name it NMR, but also forget talking about technology because that is prohibited, also in medicine. To understand different forms of the brains is actually some sort of Taoism, but it referred together with meditation. To understand different forms of the water and how you can program water is also very important when it comes to different forms of fats. To understand different forms of neural forms is not easy. And some humans also might develop epilepsy if you are working too much on different forums. To understand neuro different forms of the terms, it's not easy, but also to understand different forms of psychology. There are many disorders when it comes to leading and when it comes to different models. Of course, there are different forms of malformations in medicine, but they all might be extremely false, like you also seen in 2020. To understand healthcare, actually, people should invent a millions of different tea, like also my company. But it's not easy to demonstrate that on any type of higher level together with image of medicine, because in medicine maybe, just maybe there is no quality. So my brand is also very, very difficult when it comes to different forms of conditions together with different forms of the medicine. For example, in different forms of the sectors, the talk about the tech or the technology is extremely prohibited, and the bosses and the leaders will not allow that you talk about any form of technology, not women's and not men's, because it is simply about coding. If you know to code, that's okay. If you do not know to code, then it's not okay. But women's might be prohibited to code in some company. So they are going to work more on difficulty about emotions. If you think that emotions are very simple, probably you are extremely wrong because the emotions also affect a simple mouth, the aesthetics, the simple body, but also simple elegance. To understand Alzheimer's disease, AD, it's also not simple. But of course, it have very difficulty also together with some wounds or some symptoms together of different forms of the cases of dementia. Of course, it's not easy to understand different forms of the many medicine condition for Alzheimer's. When the disease advances, the symptoms actually include the problems with the language or disorientation. Of course, do not mess this together with any forms of motivation or any forms of the markets. In markets, there are millions of injury and clinical depressions and high blood pleasure and pressure actually. And of course, do not mess this together with any forms of the company or with the history. Very important to understand different forms of imaging, but also different forms of simple forms of disease that can come along with markets. Probably in modeling, also the muscle is actually important. But in Taoism, they are focusing much more on meditation and standing positions. There are millions of standing positions, but they're all actually very, very difficult. And most of people could not even make them. There's also a lot of cardiology, especially in medicine sectors. And of course, some people might study the heart defect, as also called maybe like your partner or your birth. Or when it come to me, I was born in 910, that was 1,000 years ago, and do not push me to do any other motivational obsessions about that. It's a fiction. If you think that your birth is not a fiction, probably you should also think about 1 million disasters that come along with the women's are what they think about genetics. Of course, genetics are not simple, but also think about different forms of genetics together with different forms of the models. That's quite a heavy chain to think about. Also, to think about different forms of manifestations, it's not simple, but also to thinking about beauty. Probably you should think also to different forms of the films or the simple forms of the image that come along with the music or the sense for it. Of course, it's also important to build a healthier body together with healthier mouth, but also to understand different forms of the medicine and how you could help your family. My family, all the people in the world are extremely difficult. And if my mom is universe, of course, that is also difficult because then it's not a human. To think about the fiction about a human is also important for the right mental health. The mental health is actually very complex. If you will go mental health together with the reality, you are going to get out millions of syndromes or even the disease because you are going to be very frustrated with reality. Do you know how different forms can be very difficult in life, also for mothers, also for women, or for different forms of the family? If my family is all world and we are all poor, of course, we need to become wealthier. This film, it's not perfect. It have many mistakes inside. My speech is not perfect. If you want something perfect, you should look for 2 minute spots or extreme movies about celebrity, but that's not me. Here it's more about heart or how it all begins and usually become with fiction, but also with health. If you are wanting more and more reality, probably you are going to lose everything you think it's good and you are going to start thinking about cells and different forms of disease, and that's extremely difficult. The reality might be also programming, and imagine someone programmed you a deaf. So do you understand the problem of the reality or programming? In programming there is also millions different forms of the ethics, and you must have all those ethics. If you do not have those ethics, that is a big problem. Of course, how much wrong the programming could actually be if someone would program you that you get some disease. Do you understand the problem of the programming? The programming can be very good, or it must be very ethical. If programming is not encoding, if that's not ethical, then it can corrupt your head. It can also corrupt the models. It can corrupt the brands, the patents, any forms of the company and stage that come along with it. And usually the coding is very difficult. To understand different forms of disease is not simple, but also to understand the system of the politics. To understand different forms of the heart is also important, but also referring to Taoism, not to think about any form of surgery. To understand the syndrome of heart is also not very simple because it comes together with the lungs, and of course how strong the lungs are and their defense system against the disease. To understand different forms of cardiomyopathy is also important if you are looking for the heart muscle. To understand those symptoms that might be in superhumans, it's actually not simple. If you understand simple forms of the heart, you might also understand what could occur if you are becoming more known or more strong. You might be resistant against diseases. To understand different forms of simple form together with tetralogy is also important, but also to understand different forms of aortas that come along with the heart. Actually, difficulty in every area, in every history, and also the difficulty of wars that politics are making, but also different forms of the simple forms together with diagrams. It's not easy, especially not in medicine, but also not if you are looking on all body. There are a lot of different common sense about different forms of the shape. And of course, if you understand those shape, you are going to understand humans also. The humans, it's not easy. And also to think about humans, it's not easy. The majority of humans are not thinking about body. And even if you would talk some nonsense about the body, you might be 2% right. But let's look from the other point. What if you would be 50% right? Do you see? You are already half a doctor. But of course, because you are not having the diploma or the license, you are not actually very official doctor, but you can still help for some friends. Sometimes your friends can also help you with different forms of health evolution, but not always. Sometimes they are going to work for you if you are going to have a company, or you are going to work for your friends if they are having a company. And from there on, you are actually under the terms of the work. Of course, it's not easy to explore different forms of our theory and different forms of the development in different forms of the films. To understand the greater theories is also not simple, but also to think about different forms of the medicine together with the programming, it's not simple. If you think in this area is any evolution, probably you are wrong also. To understand different forms of the blood, of course, you must look for the different forms of the hormone, but it's all described in my book, G and Tommy. It is simple fiction of the medicine. To understand different forms of the blood cells, it's not easy when it comes to the family of the world, but of course, you can put the pressure on the blood and make it like water. And what really happened with water, you can actually program it and you can become superhuman. It's not easy to understand different forms of the heroes that are along the fiction, but also together with the films or in software industry. It is just 100% truth that every doctor is also hero, and also every leader in software is 100% hero. And of course, they are some sort of proteins for other people and what other people do with themselves. However, every human have a lot of rights, and also to respect those rights sometimes is very important, but not too much. To understand different forms of anatomy is also important, but also to understand the old science of Taoism and histology, but also history to some point. To understand different forms of the systems is actually important, but also to understand different forms of the models. To understand simple forms of the blood is also important, and you can refer to my book, Simple Forms of the Fiction of Medicine. To understand different forms of the simple hydration is also important in modeling. And also, if you understand different forms of the cells, you are going to also understand the blood disorders that models might have, to understand the ability that models might have. It's very, very important if you are going to lead them. But no one think that leading is a chaos and you could not lead any model to anything because they are actually very, very difficult. To understand different forms of the simple forms cells is very important, but also to understand descriptions of the different forms of the limited, limited medicine. The medicine is limited because it tried to diagnose everything, and that might be very, very, very difficult. And it's very difficult to go with all medicine goals because they are actually sometimes want to build more and more definitions, and those definitions means failure. The older medicine, of course, it's going together with simple forms of Reiki, and it's not as much approved in medicine, but it's actually in the sector of the therapy. Psychiatry, it's also some sort of Reiki. The difference is that Reiki is actually using your body to heal yourself, but the psychiatry actually thinks that you can only improve together with the simple forms of the pills. To understanding the history is also important to develop your wealth and health, but also the fortune, and also to send the appropriate simple forms for the politics to pay for their mistakes in the history. To detect different forms of mistakes, it's not easy, but also to understand the production in the corruption together with different forms of medicine if there is too much politics. To understand different forms of the degree of software is also important to build ethical life. But also, if you think that you can actually develop and develop and develop software, you might be wrong again. Sometimes you must transform your life back to history and to understand what happened in history, but not to investigate too much. Sometimes the history is too painful, but sometimes you also must forget what is painful and just charge for what people did spend. For example, if me did spend $20 million for the medicine, of course the medicine must pay that back. It's very, very difficult if you are buying things for people and people do not pay it back. That's extremely, extremely difficult in medicine, also in software, but also in modeling. To understand different forms of the clinics is not simple, especially if those are the Taoism clinics. Those Taoism clinics are extremely different than usual clinics, but are also extremely limited when it comes to high level injury. To understand little injury, also to understand how to understand different forms of simple people, but also what can happen to the people. But you can also actually, with Taoistical clinic, can actually build much, much better effects on a human well-being. Not too easy to understand for any doctors, and some doctors might even have the syndrome of the depression when they see anything like that. To understand different forms of the women's, it's not easy because probably 5% of women are going to go against any forms of Taoism. And from that point of view, you can see all the women as a cancer of this world. To understand different forms of psychology that men might have about women, of course, is also not easy, but also not easy to understand different forms of DNA exploration that women are having, and probably also lacking the vitamins B12 usually because they are thinking that just mating with others is everything. Usually, Nobel Prizes are not for me, but of course, more and more health. Sometimes it's not easy to understand different forms of community and the health that should go together with populations in Africa or together with my family. To understand my family, then probably you should also understand different forms of the Africa. To understand the world, it's not easy because in this world there is a lot of people, and if the world is Africa, of course the medicine become extremely, extremely difficult. And of course, also, if you are going to do evolution on the web, also think about alcohol. The alcohol is extremely difficult because it's actually presented in different forms of the medicine also, but not for the same purpose the teenagers are using it. To transform different forms of animals, but also different forms of humans, it's not easy, or how you are looking on different forms of the cells. To understand fiction, it might be 10% of understanding everything what happened in a history from 2018 to 2022, but also to understand different forms of the bleeding of people and how much problems the people had because they did not know about the vitamin B12. The vitamins are very important, but also during any epidemic or during any type of cancer, the vitamins B12 are extremely important. To understand different forms of the heart also is very important, but also to understand different forms of the vitamins and how those can affect on a body. Of course, you can have also the T vitamins, but also different forms of the simple forms of meta apps. If you are going to build the database about different forms of the vitamins, of course, do not think that any forms on the web are vitamins because that would be a terrible lie. To understand different forms of adrenaline, it's also important when it comes to apps, and you should not overdo apps because some apps also actually have very, very difficult conditions. To understand different forms of the D3 vitamins is also very important. But of course, those vitamins you can also get out from the sun. To understand ethics, it's not simple. But sometimes ethics also come out of nonsense, and nonsense is also important.